What's happening, y'all? Welcome inside the Fantasy Stock Exchange. Danny and Bush coming at you with our top Dynasty wide receiver buys and sells. Today, we're going to be breaking down a couple guys that we are buying at the wide receiver position in Dynasty Fantasy Football Leagues, a couple guys that we are selling at the wide receiver position in Dynasty Fantasy Football Leagues. We'll of course, be referencing market value via Keep Trade Cut, our own rankings, all that good stuff. Today, we're going to be talking, and all week, we're going to be talking about Dynasty buys and sells. Next week, we'll be doing big-time upgrades and overhauls to our rankings manifestos as well. So stay tuned for that in the coming days. But before we get into it, Danny, how you doing?
Doing well, doing well. And yeah, as you guys know, for the past 3, 4, 5 months, we've been pretty much redraft focused, but ready to roll up the sleeves and project some Dynasty videos. So I know you guys have been clamoring at the bit, watching some more Dynasty content. Obviously, a lot of you guys, your leagues have fully finished. Well, I mean, it has fully finished with Week 18 being behind us now. So we know Dynasty is year-round. We know Dynasty is focused year-round. And realistically, the majority of the value, the majority of the opportunity comes in the offseason. So some of these moves, some of these buys, some of these sells, especially at the wide receiver position, as Corey will get into, are going to be very, very valuable for you going forward. Obviously, getting some, wide receiver sleepers that could potentially absolutely dominate in terms of their value come this time next year.
Yeah, exactly. And a quick reminder before we get into the video, our Underdog Fantasy giveaway will be ending before the wild card game on Saturday this week. So if you guys haven't already taken the plunge, signed up on Underdog Fantasy, use that promo code FSE at sign up and first deposit. You'll get 100% back on whatever you put in. So if you put in $20, you'll have $40 on the site to play with. And the giveaway that we're running, one of 5 $50 site credits could be yours. Not a lot of people have signed up. We're not a very big YouTube channel. You have a very, very good chance of winning one of those as well. And as a bonus for using our promo code and not somebody else's promo code, you guys will have a special pick'em line for the wildcard games where Justin Herbert, all he has to do is go over 0.5 completions, and then you can, fill out a pick'em entry with 3, 4, 5, whatever you decide to do, and you get that one as basically a freebie for using our promo code. So a lot of value over there. But before we get into the video, as always, let's hit the intro. Okay, so like I said at the top of the video, we are talking Dynasty wide receiver buys and sells. And typically at the wide receiver position, the types of wide receivers we're looking to buy on at this time of year are guys that we think can appreciate in value throughout the duration of the offseason. This typically means that we're staying away from veterans who are very, very productive in a real-life fantasy point projection type of sense, because the guys that appreciate in value over the course of the offseason are generally young guys, because we're focused on, the NFL draft and draft picks and stuff. We're not necessarily focused on what guy is going to be your wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2 in your starting lineup come, August and September. We're not really focused on that this time of year. So a lot of the guys that we're buying and investing in, if we're rebuilding, if we're trying to turn a rebuild into a contender or something like that, is guys that are going to have insulated value throughout the duration of the offseason. And generally speaking, the wide receiver position is a safe position to do that at, because they're not as injury prone or, situation dependent or opportunity based as, for example, the running back position would be.
Yeah, no, 100%. The reason why we're buying receivers at all at this point is because we know that they have a lot more insulated value. And we'll talk about this a lot more in the running back video in particular, but there's not many running backs that you're buying right now strictly for value or paying top dollar at this current point. Like, as you guys will see when we get to the running back video, that's going to be more so, lower end guys that we think can appreciate, rather than, buying, top 10 level running backs at this point. Because as Corey mentioned, in terms of the Dynasty calendar, this is not the time you want to be buying running backs.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm glad you brought that up. I did a video last offseason called the Dynasty Fantasy Football Calendar. It's still relevant. I didn't talk about really any player analysis. It was just kind of a general strategy video. So if you guys want to go back and check that one out, I think I did that in like June, July, sometime around there. Just search the Dynasty Fantasy Football Calendar. But anyways, let's get into the actual buys and sells themselves. We'll start off with Danny's first buy here, a guy that we were both quite high on, I would say, coming into the season, but a guy that maybe had some things go wrong for him.
Yeah, for sure. My first buy is actually going to be Jeudy, wide receiver of the Denver Broncos, currently valued on Keep Trade Cut as the wide receiver 28 overall, equivalent value of guys like, late 2024 first, Terry McLaurin, Jahan Dotson. And I basically broke this down in a tweet. So a good pal of ours, Ron Stewart, tweeted out the fact that Jerry Jeudy's, terrible season labeled by a lot of people, dealing with injuries, dealing with a lot of ambiguous circumstances this year, wasn't as bad as people thought. He was the wide receiver 20 in PPR points per game, 13.6 PPR points per game, better than guys like DK Metcalf, Michael Pittman, Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, Marquise Brown, DJ Moore, Juju Smith-Schuster, and Cortland Sutton, like Ron List. But I actually broke it down even further. If you solely basis off the games that Jerry Jeudy played 50% or more of the snaps, which actually take out 3 games in the sample of 13.6 PPR points per game, you get a very, very favorable stat line this year. You get a player that, despite the bottom 5 circumstance in the entire NFL, despite dealing with, poor quarterback play, poor play calling, poor offensive structure as a whole, had a really, really good year. 92 targets, 62 receptions, 896 yards, and 6 touchdowns in those 12 games. About 15.7 PPR points per game in that stretch of games he was healthy. Yet his dynasty value went down a cliff. And for me personally, I'm just kind of trying to wrap my head around it. So you're talking about a 23-year-old wide receiver who finally showed that he could be, a number 1 level talent in the NFL with a new coach, potential increased offensive stability entering 2023, yet his value has fallen dramatically. Like, this is a guy I'm buying everywhere I can get. There's a chance next year where we're looking at a 1,200, 1,300 yard, 24-year-old wide receiver that you are paying a late 2024 first for, or a 27 going on 28-year-old Terry McLaurin for. The level of ceiling that you have here with Jerry Jeudy, even with average to slightly below average offensive insulation in Denver, I'm buying every share I can get. At least I know he's a good player. And at wide receiver 28, you're kind of getting all those question mark wide receivers. I think he's well past that range, in my opinion.
Yeah, you're going to notice a theme with a lot of these dynasty wide receiver buys is that we really don't care about situation that much when it comes to the wide receiver position, especially if you're a rebuilding team where you don't need that production right away. A guy like Jerry Jeudy, there's also multiple avenues where this situation changes dramatically for him.
Yes.
He was in trade talks for the trade deadline this past year. And if Denver is just as bad next year as they were this year, then there's a good chance he gets moved in a contract year at the deadline, potentially to a new team, or he plays out his final year of his rookie contract and he's, a free agent or whatever the case is. Maybe he gets franchise tagged and they trade him or something like that. There's a lot of avenues for things to change. So we don't like to focus on, he's stuck with Russell Wilson the next 5 years. We don't exactly know, A, if that's a bad thing, because coming into the season, we would have said that was a good thing. And B, if that stuff is going to remain consistent year over year. They were the lowest scoring offense in the NFL this year. I don't think anybody expected that to happen. I think with better coaching, maybe, it humbled Russ a little bit. I don't really know exactly what needs to change there, but I think the moral of the buy here is that you're buying into a talented receiver.
100%. And it's funny to me because you mentioned, people are negative on the situation, but even in spite of that situation, we're still talking about a 7.7 target per game receiver with almost 75 yards per game in the healthy games he played this year. So worst case scenario, you're getting a player that can be a wide receiver 2, currently a wide receiver 3 cost, who's, yes, 23 years old. And then you mentioned, again, what if he gets flipped? Maybe he goes, traded in the offseason to Dallas, who needs a speed wide receiver as their number 2. Or if he doesn't get moved, it's probably a telltale sign that Russell Wilson has bounced back and that team is in the midst of a playoff spot. So yeah, with Jerry Jeudy, there's really no downside to buying him at this current point. Everybody's low. Everybody's deflated about the Denver Broncos season. This is the time you capitalize on it.
Yeah, exactly. And again, another guy, similar theme. We're talking about guys that are situation challenged, let's say. They're guys that are not in great situations, but we are buying into the talent of the player, which is what we're always doing at the wide receiver position. You guys will notice our dynasty rankings don't move nearly as much as keep trade cut values because we're not typically as reactive to what's happening rather than, the raw numbers of like the target share of the player and that kind of stuff. We're not going to overreact to big weeks here and there. And a guy like Drake London is a perfect example because right now you can acquire Drake London at wide receiver 14 price tag, according to Keep Trade Cut, equivalent value of a mid to late 2023 first round pick plus a small piece maybe on top of that. He's ranked around guys like Jameson Williams, like Christian Watson, like Devontae Smith and Chris Olave among young wide receivers, ranked around guys like Stephon Diggs, Cooper Kupp, Devontae Adams among aging wide receivers. Now, obviously, those are kind of apples to oranges comparisons. It's going to depend where your team is. But the final numbers for Drake London from his rookie season, which, again, he was a top 8 overall pick. He was a guy that the Falcons were very impressed with coming out of training camp and that kind of stuff. 117 targets, 72 catches, 866 yards, and 4 touchdowns. Those numbers do not jump off the page. They're not crazy, 1,400-yard rookie season like a Justin Jefferson, for example, but a 28.2% target share, 28% reception share, 30% receiving yard share, and a 23.5% touchdown share was basically across the board better numbers than Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave, except for Garrett Wilson's touchdown percentage. Basically, he was, based on the market share of his offense, which was one of the most, if not the most, run-heavy offenses in the NFL, just as dominant as those other guys were. Since 2006, a tweet from our buddy Dynasty IM, there's been 61 instances of a wide receiver putting up a 28% target share. And of all 61 of those instances, Drake London's 9.8 points per game is the lowest by far. And it has nothing to do with him being inefficient, has nothing to do with him, maybe not making the most of his targets. What we know about Drake London is that he was in a situation so devoid of pass volume that we're talking about a guy that just could not get into the end zone, could not rack up the yardage, because when Mariota was in, especially, they were just not throwing the ball. Drake London is, in fact, the only wide receiver other than Odell Beckham Jr. to command a 28% target share as a rookie. And I remind you, too, Drake London is a year younger than Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson. So age-adjusted production-wise, we're talking about a guy who had a comparable season to Odell Beckham Jr. as a rookie, but the raw numbers don't reflect that.
Yeah, 100%. With Drake London, I mean, anytime you watch a guy play, you can see he could separate. Anytime you watch a guy play, he's getting elite volume comparative to his circumstances. And it's pretty remarkable because I know when he came back fully, obviously, everybody remembers Drake London's season as being really, really good to start, really, really good to end. If you take his end of season splits with the last 3 or 4 games, this is a guy that was consistently commanding over 35% of his team's targets each and every week. Yes, he had that bad middle portion, might leave a sour taste to a lot of people, but realistically, if he had a whole season of where he produced like he did at the beginning and what he produced at the end, he would be ranked ahead of Chris Olave. He'd be ranked ahead of Garrett Wilson. That is a level of volume that he was making despite these circumstances that was put at hand. So yes, when you're looking at the Atlanta Falcons projecting forward, worst case scenario, you're stuck with Desmond Ridder. Desmond Ridder, by the way, already provided more volume than what Marcus Mariota was providing. But there's also a circumstance that people aren't baking in quite enough, that the Atlanta Falcons are picking 8th overall. If a Will Levis, if a CJ Stroud, if an Anthony Richardson, if their quarterback that they feel comfortable with is available, or if they have to move up slightly to be able to do so, there is a really good possibility that there's a new quarterback in town that's not a 3rd round level investment this time next year on a team that has a really good situation, could add more passing volume, as you kind of mentioned, could be, an average to above average level offense. And if that's the case, Drake London's going to be the clear number 1 target on an ascending situation, which is exactly what you want to buy in Dynasty. We already know he's talented. We already know the situation's bad, but there's possibilities, there's outs to a potential increase in situation this offseason.
Yeah, and there's a couple of concerns people are going to have. Kyle Pitts wasn't there the rest of the season. Maybe that's why he got more targets. And it's kind of like the TJ Hawkinson, Amon-Ra St. Brown situation. The bottom line is that he produced, right? That's all that matters. Yes, Kyle Pitts was out of the lineup, but we'd rather see him produce than not produce. And that's the important part. And it also coincides with the fact that rookie wide receivers typically get better as the season goes along. And that's kind of a coincidence from that perspective. Again, Drake London, talented wide receiver, very young, high dynasty value insulation because he was a high rookie pick that people had a high opinion of coming into his rookie season as well. High draft capital, all that stuff combined with the fact that we saw this guy do it on the field is the important part. Drake London is a very safe investment for you guys who are rebuilding teams who want to ship off. Maybe you have 7 first-round picks this year. If you want to ship off your 111 for Drake London plus, a Donovan Peoples-Jones who might have increased value, who we're going to talk about in a second, you might be able to get trades like that done in leagues where everybody is very focused on raw numbers and situation and stuff that just typically isn't as important for rookie wide receivers and fantasy wide receivers in dynasty leagues in general. So Drake London, basically the way I view Drake London is that he should be valued amongst the likes of Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson, who I think have both benefited from their rookie seasons more so than the way Drake London has from his. But like I said, market share wise, if you just compare them on a flat, no context offensive basis, it's Garrett Wilson had an offense that threw nearly 700 times. Drake London had an offense that threw 414 times. That is a vastly different raw output for a rookie wide receiver, and that's why the market share statistics are so different.
Yeah, fully love Drake London. Transitioning to my next buy, another rookie wide receiver. It's Treylon Burks, wide receiver of the Tennessee Titans. Wide receiver 22 on Keep Trade Cut right now, equivalent value according to the site with Michael Pittman, DJ Moore, 2023 late first, and George Pickens. All assets that I would prefer Treylon Burks over. And when it comes to Treylon Burks, when he was healthy this year, he was a lot better than people realize. A 23.6% target rate when healthy. Multiple instances of him looking like he would finally break out, but he kept getting hurt, kept dealing with the play of Malik Willis and Josh Dobbs at the tail end of the year, and didn't really have that, statistical production that a lot of people are eyeing. So as a result, he's kind of fallen off the cliff. But the thing that I'm focusing on is that with Ryan Tannehill scheduled to be back next year, That's crucial for his development. And Burks has already shown that when he's healthy, he commands elite wide receiver 1 level volume. A 23.6% target rate for a rookie wide receiver is remarkable. The only reason that we're not talking about it as much right now is because of the success of his peers in this class. But I definitely think from a pure talent standpoint, Treylon Burks can re-enter that tier with a very, very good sophomore season. For a guy getting valued as the wide receiver 22, that's a huge level of value to accrue in a year. He was a guy that was able to command 7 targets per game down the stretch in games that he was fully healthy in, despite really only being used in a part-time role. We're talking about a player that was in 50% of the snaps, 70% of the snaps, never was truly a 85, 90+% snap type of player. And I get it. It's definitely a projection to say, he's going to fully become this true full-time X at the next level this upcoming year. But when his peripherals are this damn good for a part-time player, I'm buying that every chance I can get. I get it. It's risky, but he's got the profile that can ascend into a top 5 to 10 level dynasty wide receiver, which I'm taking swings on any chance I can get. Wide receiver, in my opinion, especially when you're dealing with young guys like this, is basically swinging on the players that the public is worried about, the public has angst about. And Treylon Burks, given his rookie season, is going to have a lot of people worried. They're going to see the box score. They're going to see that he's been hurt. They're going to see that he's not used on a consistent basis. But what we have seen is that when he's on the field and he's getting the ball, he's a damn good wide receiver in the NFL. And the fact that you can get Burks plus right now for a guy like George Pickens, the fact that you could flip a 2023 late first with a lot of question marks at the tail end of the first round of this draft, you can flip that straight now for Treylon Burks. I'm doing that in a heartbeat.
Yeah, and again, going back to what we said about Drake London, Treylon Burks was among the highest, projected wide receivers in this draft class. That is still fresh in people's minds. People haven't forgotten that Treylon Burks is going to be a guy that people are going to want to make excuses for because he was so highly sought after coming into the draft cycle. And I think as the offseason goes along, people will catch up to, the target rate and some of the things that you kind of outlined. And his value will start to accumulate, even though he's not playing any games. People just kind of review his rookie season under a microscope, maybe watch the tape or whatever. And Treylon Burks will definitely be a guy that people are going to be excited about as a breakout candidate going into next year.
100%.
And if Ryan Tannehill is still the quarterback, which they don't really have any other options. Malik Willis showed them nothing. They're not picking super high. They're not going to have a pick that's, in range of like a Will Levis, potentially even a CJ Stroud or a Bryce Young. So they're probably stuck with Ryan Tannehill unless they completely decide to blow things up. And as we kind of talked about going into the season, Mike Vrabel was not going to play Treylon Burks on the field 100% of the snaps right from jump. He was going to have to earn it, and he started to earn it. The only issue was every time he started to earn it, he started to deal with injury, and that's something that we can't really predict. We just got to hope that he can continue that momentum going into his second season. So definitely agree with the Treylon Burks take as well. If you're going to swing for a guy like Treylon Burks, you could be rewarded with a top 5 dynasty receiver this time next year. And you actually mentioned a guy that you would prefer Treylon Burks to in Michael Pittman Jr., who is a big-time buy for me. And I think when you're buying veterans like a guy like Michael Pittman Jr., he's 25 years old, third-year wide receiver this past year, going into his 4th season. The type of veterans that I like to buy in on are guys that were heavily impacted by situation. Again, a similar theme throughout this entire video. Michael Pittman Jr., just like Jerry Jeudy, was part of one of the bottom 2 offenses in the NFL. He's wide receiver 23, according to Keep Trade Cut right now. His value is actually slightly lower than a 2023 first, when this time last year, you probably would have had to pay mid-2023 first plus a second to even get in the conversation of acquiring Michael Pittman Jr. in trade just a year later. Pittman played for a team that scored 289 points, which was nearly 200 points less than they scored the year before, still registered a 23.5% target share after posting a 25.7% target share and a top 24 points per game season as a second-year wide receiver with Carson Wentz as his quarterback in 2021. Like I said, he's only 25 years old still. He's about to get a quarterback upgrade. They're picking top 5 in the draft. They're going to draft a rookie quarterback, most likely. CJ Stroud is the guy that continuously gets mocked to them. Maybe they like Will Levis or something like that. I would describe this season as being like the perfect storm of bad coincidences for Michael Pittman Jr., from Jonathan Taylor being banged up to Pittman being banged up himself, to the offensive line underperforming, to Matt Ryan being completely washed up, to the coaching changes, the quarterback carousel. Everything went wrong for the Indianapolis Colts and Michael Pittman Jr. this year. The bottom line is, the guy didn't get any worse at football. He's still the same caliber of player that we were projecting potentially being as good as this year's Cooper Kupp coming into the season. There was plenty of us, myself included, that thought 3rd round Michael Pittman, this is the guy. This is the dude that's going to ascend to the 1,500 yard, 10 touchdown season that wins people leagues. And that didn't happen because the offense was so bad. He's still going to be just in his 4th year. For those of you guys that buy into the contract year narrative, age 26 season. and he left a sour taste in the mouth of fantasy managers this past year. So he's going to come at a discount just based off of recency bias.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, the way I look at it right now, I'm fine with Michael Pittman's value. And if you're looking at a player that realistically, given their level of projectable, 2023 production, is a guy that's going to raise tremendously, because we do expect a huge bounce back year from Michael Pittman, given the situation he was dealt at hand. Still a young player that you kind of mentioned. I honestly think, and I mean, it's going to be the macro theme of this video, that if you're buying a wide receiver, you want the young guys that can ascend into that elite market value territory. But when you're buying veterans, you want guys that are simply discounted based off the projection that we can have at hand. A guy like Michael Pittman, we know that he's coming off a down year. We know that the situation is going to be better. So you're buying, last year's production when we can expect, a 120% level output of that production this upcoming year. So yeah, I fully agree. I mean, Michael Pittman, if you want to buy a player that can legitimately be a top 10 wide receiver this upcoming year without paying top 10 wide receiver price tags for that type of production, Michael Pittman's your guy.
Yeah, especially if you're in a situation where you're trying to go from rebuilder to contender, which I imagine many of you guys following our advice the last 2 years might find yourselves in, and you have 6 first-round picks this year and 7 second-round picks, and you already have a young stable of players. You don't maybe want to spend all of those picks on rookie wide receivers and rookie running backs and rookie quarterbacks from this class. And somebody might, during the rookie draft or close to the rookie draft, is like, I love Josh Downs. I need to get him. I love Zach Charbonnet. I need to get him. At the 201, they'll give you Michael Pittman straight up for the 201 because they have rookie fever. Maybe you have to, add in some smaller pieces to get that done. But that's the type of moves that I'd be making, especially if you find yourself in a situation where you're trying to flip the switch from rebuilder to contender. Because Pittman, while he's a good contending piece, is also still young enough that he's going to, be able to withstand the maturation of a rookie quarterback if he has another down year next year.
Moving off of the buys, now we actually head into the sells. And the disclaimer I want to make is, people hear the term sell and automatically assume, it's a derogatory term. Oh, well, this guy's a sell because he's not a good player, or this guy's a sell because he's not going to perform. In Dynasty fantasy football, sells are not players that we expect to be much worse in talent or production than maybe the mainstream does. When we're selling these players, we're basically saying, okay, in terms of opportunity bundles, in terms of value that we can accumulate back if we're moving these players, who are the players right now that are priced at a point where we would prefer alternatives, or we'd prefer, maybe, this player plus a 2 instead of that player? My main sell is actually Jaylen Waddle, wide receiver of the Miami Dolphins, wide receiver 5 on keep trade cut. And the equivalent value pieces around him right now are 2023 earlier first, Monroe St. Brown, Garrett Wilson, T. Higgins, all those receivers for the most part. You probably could get, them plus a 2 if you were moving from Jaylen Waddle in most of your leagues. So as a result, I mean, I think he's a sell. In terms of the 2023 early first, we're basically looking at, some power positions in Bijan Robinson. The quarterbacks, Bijan Robinson should make up the top 4 of your rookie picks. And as much as I like Jaylen Waddle, I simply cannot take him over any of those assets. So getting into, Jaylen Waddle himself, obviously we know he's an elite talent, young player, 23 years old, coming off his career best, over 1,300 receiving yards. Definitely a fantastic player, especially in redraft. The reason why I'm a little bit concerned is that even despite all of that, he's still only netted about 15.3 PPR points per game. And I get it, those are going to be better splits when Tua suits up. But the main concern that I have is that even when Tua suited up, he was only on a 126 target pace across 17 games and a 21.7% seasonal target share, down from obviously his rookie year where he had 142 targets and 24.8% target share. I think most of that is due to different usage as opposed to him, declining from a pure usage standpoint. So why is that? Why is Jaylen Waddle, up there with, 28%, 29% plus target share receivers? Because he's a great player, because people want to have him on their team, because people want that explosive, dynamic player to end up developing. That's just the problem that I have with him in fantasy, and especially with other wide receivers that you can get a plus if you were to move off for Jaylen Waddle, is that if we're looking at their pure ceilings, all the range of outcomes between, Jaylen Waddle, T. Higgins, Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, they all, I would say, are probably in that, 17.5 to 19 PPR point per game type of ceiling outcome. If any of them were to hit that mark, you would feel very, very comfortable with them. You would feel very, very comfortable in that being their ceiling. If we're already kind of pricing in Jaylen Waddle like he's about to do that, whereas we're not doing it with those other players, I would simply want to tear down. I would simply want to transition. Again, he's not a must sell. He's not a player that I'm just trying to get off of all of my rosters because I think he's just going to completely nosedive in value. But if I'm able to transition into better pieces plus value, I'm always willing to do that with some of my top assets, regardless of what I think about their play in real life.
Yeah, I think realistically, just looking at the wide receiver 3 to 12 landscape in general, whoever your league mates value as wide receiver 3, 4, and 5 are going to come at a maybe it's a good idea to sell type of area versus wide receivers, 10 to 12. Because if you can get DK Metcalf and a second for Jaylen Waddle, I think you could probably make the argument that that's a better package. Or if you can get, like you said, T. Higgins in a second, Amon-Ra in a second, whatever. I'm not really on board with selling Jaylen Waddle because I think his value is that much higher than those guys. I think they're probably on similar flat tiers. If your league values them the same way, if they're like, I'm not giving you T. Higgins in a 2, T. Higgins and Waddle are very similar, then probably don't sell them like you kind of said. But I'm kind of the general philosophy of Jaylen Waddle being a sell is definitely on par. If he's going to be wildly overvalued relative to the rest of the guys in his tier, then I think it's probably a fine move to make. And also, you could tier up potentially if people view him very close to Chase or very close to Jefferson in that 2 first type of value range that those guys are probably commanding.
Waddle, again, very good player. Not exactly sure that his range of outcomes is all that different than the guys below him.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say on Waddle, and then we can move on to the next guy, is trusting efficiency year over year can be a slippery slope. We saw just last year with Deebo Samuel, he was a consensus top 6 to 8 dynasty wide receiver, and then he's since plummeted when his efficiency kind of came back to earth, and the same could be true of a guy like Jaylen Waddle. So I think that's a fair take there. Moving on to my sell, this is where a market value thing is a real factor. It's not necessarily that I don't like this player. In fact, I would say I'm very optimistic on this player going forward. But Jameson Williams from the Detroit Lions, currently wide receiver 18 right now. Again, give or take about a mid to late first round type of archetype in terms of the equivalent value there. He's going around players, like Drake London, Christian Watson, some of those other rookie wide receivers, and then some of the aging guys. Wide receiver 18, though, screams to me that the market is strictly looking at his bull case and not taking into account what his bear case would be, because he is, just like Treylon Burks, relatively speaking, a projection. We saw the long touchdowns, the ascension of this Lions offense obviously plays a part in this as well. And a lot of people will give him a pass for being first year removed from the ACL tear and, be optimistic about his health going into his second season. And that's all well and good. And I'm, on the same page. I think that's, valid reasons why we should be high on Jameson Williams. But the issue with Jameson Williams lies in the fact that he did miss some crucial development time as a rookie. He is priced among more proven wide receivers that are still young in a rebuild scenario, or other guys that have proven it more if you're looking for production. We think Jameson Williams is good. That is what the market is saying by saying, he's wide receiver 18, but we know Drake London is good. We know that Christian Watson is good in the samples that we've seen. We have a solid idea that Treylon Burks, Jahan Dotson, and maybe even George Pickens, if you're a big George Pickens guy, is good. It's simply a risk mitigation thing for me with Jameson Williams. If you can get any of the names I just mentioned, Treylon Burks especially stands out. If you can get Treylon Burks plus a second round pick for Jameson Williams, to me, it behooves you to hold Jameson Williams, knowing that they have similar risk factors. Both guys highly valued, highly sought after in rookie drafts. So they're both going to, if they prove that they can produce, ascend at a very rapid pace. I just think we have more risk with Jameson Williams given what we know about his injury and what we didn't see from him as a rookie outside of the long touchdowns.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think he's a good player, but like you mentioned, the market's already basically 100% certain that he's going to be a good player because wide receiver 18, we're talking about 4 wide receiver spots below Drake London and 4 wide receiver spots above Treylon Burks. That's basically fully making the bet that this is going to be a stud 1,100-yard wide receiver 2 in his second year. As much as I like Jameson Williams, realistically right now, a deal that you could probably make that maybe not a lot of people talk about, but do you think it's possible that you can ship Jameson Williams in a 2 for like Jerry Jeudy in a 1? Because I think in some cases, especially given their valuations, wide receiver 28 versus wide receiver 18, that could be a possible scenario where maybe you go to a contender and you say, hey, listen, obviously you want some, you want to add some youth depth that has a lot of upside. I got Jameson Williams here for you. Your first is probably going to be in the 110 to 112 range next year, which, again, you're going to say that to them, but you're always obviously banking on the upside case that maybe he doesn't have as good of a year as he expects. So let's just say hypothetically, next year's 110 to 112 and Jerry Jeudy in exchange for Jameson Williams in this year's 204. I think that's a realistic move that you can do in a lot of leagues.
Yeah, and if you wanted to swap that out for another young receiver like Jahan Dotson or George Pickens, that would also make some sense as well. There's a lot of things you can do with Jameson Williams is basically the point. The market is certain that he's good or borderline certain that he's good. All I'm saying is that it's a possibility that he could lose value at wide receiver 18 prices because we're already banking on the fact that we think he's going to be the same player that we saw from Alabama, and we haven't necessarily seen every indication to say that's going to be the case because he's got limited play under his belt. He's pretty much just been a boomer bust deep threat so far. And that was kind of a concern for me coming out of Alabama is this guy going to develop into a full-fledged wide receiver one? Because they obviously have a wide receiver one there in Amon-Ra St. Brown. So we can get on to your next sell. We already kind of mentioned his name a couple times, and then we'll close it out with some honorable mentions, but I'll let you get into George Pickens, who obviously I made my thoughts clear on throughout the Dynasty offseason last year.
Yeah, George Pickens, wide receiver 21 in terms of keep trade cut value. One spot ahead of Treylon Burks, which is just completely asinine in my opinion. I already mentioned that Treylon Burks had near 24% target rate when he was healthy this year, or actually on the season. So even games that he played banged up, near 24% target rate, targets per route run. So this is clearly a player that we know can command targets. On the flip side with George Pickens, we're talking about a full-time player this year that commanded a 15.3% target share and a 15.9% target rate. And yeah, I get it. It's cool. You know, he can make some sick grabs, bro. We'll see his highlights. You know, you search his name on Twitter, you search his name on YouTube, you're seeing him make a one-handed snag. Are we really just going to prop this guy up as this next elite talent because of a couple highlight plays that you see on YouTube? The tired take is that, oh, George Pickens makes sick catches. I get it. He does make sick catches. The wired take is that, why does he have to make sick catches? Because he can't separate at a consistent basis. We know that this guy is very, very good running the 9 route. He can line up outside. He can play deep. He can go up and high point the football. But realistically, for him to pay off higher than wide receiver 21, which, again, if we're buying a young wide receiver that's already this high in value, we're making the bet he can accumulate in value. We need him to develop a full route tree. And again, you talked about his concerns on film. We talked about his concerns as a prospect. We talked about, you know, potential attitude there. He doesn't seem like the player based off his style that can automatically turn into Diontae Johnson where he can run every single row, or turn into, you know, Devontae Adams where he can run every single row. Realistically, if he's going to be this, you know, outside high point dominant wide receiver, we're looking at, you know, Mike Williams. We're looking at my comp for him, which again, we'll do a little name the player, if you will, if you guys are watching this video. We're talking about a player a few years ago with a 14.2% target share in his rookie season and a 19.9% target rate in his rookie season that nobody really seems to be, you know, comparing to George Pickens. In fact, if anybody labels this name out for George Pickens, a lot of George Pickens people are going to be very disappointed. And that player is Michael Gallup. When I watch George Pickens play, Michael Gallup is the person that screams out to me. He could be a very good wide receiver too, especially in real life. High point the football, you know, run a lot of good vertical concepts for your offense. But if you're expecting him to be this, you know, wide receiver 1 type, which if we're buying him at wide receiver 21, we're hoping he can send into that top 10 dynasty atmosphere. If he can't run a full assortment of route tree, if he can't run a full assortment of routes, realistically, he's just going to be labeled into that wide receiver 2 that is going to peak at, you know, 21 to 22% of the targets and ultimately provide more real life, you know, watching value as opposed to fantasy production value. So in terms of George Pickens, I like the player. If he was like wide receiver 30, I'd be fine rostering him. But realistically, getting him over proven target getters like, you know, Treylon Burks, like even some of those veteran receivers labeled after him, Brandon Ayuk, you know, guys like that, I would absolutely make that transition in a heartbeat. Capitalize on the hype of George Pickens, currently valued more than a late first. I would easily just re-roll the dice, to be honest, on a better prospect.
Yeah, I mean, I've made my concerns pretty clear with George Pickens. There's not much else I need to add. I think that was exactly the archetype of player I expected coming into the league. That archetype of player, newsflash, isn't all that valuable in fantasy. Think of guys like Cortland Sutton and Mike Williams and Mike Evans and stuff. Again, when you're in a great situation, you have a great quarterback and things break right for you and you're a great red zone weapon, then yeah, you can have great seasons like Mike Evans and Mike Williams, who would be like the absolute ceiling projections for George Pickens. But most of the time, it looks like Cortland Sutton, where if you're not in a great offense, you're going to have, you know, more target dependency. You're going to make great, you know, contested catches along the sidelines and stuff. It's going to, you know, bring up the highlight reels, but I think he's a better real life receiver than he is a fantasy receiver. And again, the archetype of receivers that are hitting big time in fantasy are more of your, you know, Amon-Ra, Jaylen Waddle types who maybe don't have the 6'3", you know, 200-pound size that a guy like George Pickens has, but the production is what we're after in fantasy football. So we can move on to some honorable mentions here, and we'll close it out real quick. Sells at wide receiver just include any low-end guys that proved anything, right? Like that's usually a way to move off and pivot off of receivers to get some extra draft capital in future classes. Guys like Romeo Doubs, who had a stretch of, value where he looked like he was going to be a player in the league. Donovan Peoples-Jones had a couple good games this year. Definitely was more productive than I expected him to be over the duration of the season as well. Guys like Alec Pierce, Nico Collins, Zay Jones. If you can pick up second round picks, maybe even like 2/3 and like a small piece or something on top of these guys, then it's definitely worthwhile moving off of them, because they're not insulated to become great pieces in fantasy football unless they take drastic step forwards that you're just probably not expecting out of players that are kind of middling level talents like that. And then a couple shared buys that we have as like honorable mentions: Elijah Moore, Diontae Johnson, Rashod Bateman. With Elijah Moore and Rashod Bateman, you're kind of just trusting the spurts that you've seen. You've seen splits of Elijah Moore being a very, very productive fantasy wide receiver, where he was commanding 25% targets per route run as a rookie in the New York Jets offense, where it was like not a great situation. Obviously, a whole mess of shit happened this year. He was, disgruntled and things. I'm willing to throw it his second year if he comes out in training camp next year and looks exactly like the rookie season Elijah Moore with a new quarterback at the helm. Rashod Bateman this year, for what it's worth, 25.5% targets per route run for him, even though he was banged up his rookie season and then again in his second season. He's been productive when he's been on the field. He's been, a guy who can flash some big play upside, and he's still tethered to Lamar Jackson for what it's worth. And you could probably get both guys, I would imagine, for second round draft capital right now, maybe early to mid second round picks, get it done for you. And again, if you're one of those teams that has 6 second rounders and you don't want to completely load up on one rookie class, sending a 2 out for either of those guys makes a lot of sense. And then Diontae Johnson is also a good buy for those of you guys flipping from rebuilder to contender, because you're never going to see an unluckier season than Diontae Johnson's this year. The target share, the receiving ability, it was all on display. He was open most of the time. The drops, the inefficiencies, to me, it screams more of an outlier than something that we can expect consistently. I know he's never going to be a, sure-handed, never drops the ball receiver, but the important thing is that he can get open and he commands targets.
100%. And a name I want to mention, just because, I looked at his keep trade card value and I get it. This guy's fucking risky. This guy's burned you in the past, but God damn, Michael Thomas is the wide receiver 70 on keep trade card right now, going for an equivalent of an early 3rd round pick behind the likes of Isaiah Hodgins, Darius Slayton, Terrace Marshall, and Tyquan Thornton. Like, I get it. You can buy Michael Thomas and he can retire tomorrow. 100%. We don't know what the floor is of Michael Thomas. However, we do know the ceiling. He's a 17 PPR point per game receiver in the 3 games he played this year, which were ranked as the wide receiver 10 across the year. And we know anytime he is healthy, he's a shoo-in for getting 8 to 10 targets per game. So yes, Michael Thomas, he's risky. I get it. You probably, are going to feel sick to your stomach if you made this move. But if you're telling me right now, you could flip the 301, 302 for Michael Thomas right now and potentially make that move to a contender this year, I'm absolutely doing that every single chance I get.
Yeah, even if he's your like wide receiver 6 or whatever, he could actually very much hit and become the wide receiver 2 or 3 in your starting lineup by this time next year.
Like, we saw a 32, 33-year-old Antonio Brown retire after all of the, the offseason stuff, basically go for free and then come back and be a top 15 wide receiver for you guys.
Like, yeah, exactly. When you're it's definitely possible. If all it is injuries and he gets a clean bill of health, which is a huge question mark with him, then it's possible that he can be productive for fantasy. So, like I said, if you guys enjoyed these types of videos, leave us a like down below. Subscribe to the channel if this was the first time you guys are checking us out. We will have you covered anything and everything Dynasty Fantasy Football this coming off season. We will be bringing you some running back buys and sells, as many buys as we can possibly think of at that position for sure. And then quarterbacks and tight ends will be coming later on in the week. We'll also be breaking down some playoff best ball drafts now that we have all the seeding, all the information later on, and we'll talk about our biggest lessons learned from the season. So that's what we got on deck. Next week, we'll talk about our rankings, top 12, top 15, whatever, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, all that good stuff. So we'll be bringing you that next week. Make sure you stay tuned for that. But with that being said, peace out, and we'll talk to you soon.